Well, good evening, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Teach Climate Network workshop series. Tonight's series is on students discovering climate solutions. Please do double check that you are on mute, but feel free to turn your video on as it's always nice to see your faces. Rename yourself with your names and pronouns. If you do need closed captioning, you can enable it on the bottom bar where it says more. My name is Seth Spencer. I'm the Teach Climate Network Coordinator for Climate Generation. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm coming to you from the Dakota and Anishinaabe lands just outside of Minneapolis, Minnesota. And in just a minute, I will be turning it over to Matt Scott, the Storytelling and Engagement Manager at Project Drawdown, and our amazing presenter today on students discovering climate solutions. Climate Generation does open every presentation we do with a land acknowledgement. We take time to acknowledge the native land we are on, because one of the effects of genocide and colonization is that it can be easy to forget that we are still occupying land and that Indigenous individuals and communities are still alive and leading change in our world. We also recognize the tremendous resilience and innovative climate solutions that are created by these communities. And we, of course, seek to raise up their voices in climate change education. We are proud of the incredible diversity of our country and know that our vision for an equitable future will only be achieved when people work together, bridge experiences and expertise from across the globe. I'd also like to briefly share the vision of Climate Generation, of why we are even offering this workshop series. Our vision is to ignite and sustain the ability of educators, youth, and communities to act on the systems that perpetuate the climate crisis. We believe that we will accomplish this by through three overarching strategic goals, which are overcoming disinformation, centering anti-racism and systemic equity, and personalizing and localizing climate change action. So we do know that really focusing on climate solutions, especially with students and educators, is key to this vision. I am now going to go ahead and turn it over to Matt. Matt, take it away.
Thank you, everybody, for being here and for welcoming me here today. And just to introduce myself and this presentation in a second, I'm Matt Scott, and I lead our storytelling work at Project Drawdown, which is known as a leading resource for climate solutions. And I'm excited to dive in with you about students discovering climate solutions and what that means, what that looks like in the work that we do as Project Drawdown. One thing I would say before even really diving in and getting started is that there's going to be some interaction. There won't be breakouts in this session, but definitely some interaction where I'll be asking you to respond in the chat, respond to a couple of polls, and also, I'll be sharing a number of resources that you're able to creatively leverage in whatever way best makes sense for you and your communities. And so I will save time for some questions toward the end, but let me start to get my screen pulled up. There we go. Great. And you should be able to see my full screen, and hopefully there's not, Seth, let me know if there's a box covering the screen at all. Awesome. Cool. So again, this is Students Discovering Climate Solutions. I'm Matt Scott. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm manager of storytelling and engagement at Project Drawdown. And the first question I want to dive in and ask you all is actually a question about you, about your work, and about the really important work, critical work that you're doing as educators. And this question is, what have you shared with your students or communities when it comes to climate change and global warming? Now, I'll have something later where I ask for folks to respond in the chat, but as you'll see, this is an interactive poll. We'll have a few of these over the course of our time together. And I would ask that to respond to this question, you go to slido.com and enter that code 185896, or that you take out your smartphone, for instance, like I'm doing now, and just hold it up to the screen to scan this QR code listed. And so, yeah, if you could take a minute to pull that up, or maybe 30 seconds to pull that up, and just insert your response of what have you shared with your students or communities when it comes to climate change and global warming, it should start to populate here. So let me know, or I'll keep an eye out to see if folks are responding. And we have a pretty small group, so I'll give the group about 30 seconds or so to see if the responses are coming through. But again, if you could pull up slido.com, great, I'm seeing some responses start to come in, so that's good. And again, the code is 185896, or you could scan the QR code. As I wait to see if other responses come in, one reason I like to ask this question is just because it's a good way to see what others are doing when it comes to climate education, when it comes to engaging their communities around climate change and global warming. And it's also interesting because typically, when I ask this question of how people approach their students with climate change and global warming, I will get a wide variety of responses. And so if you're still responding to this question, feel free to add that in as we go along. Again, this is good practice as we get started with Slido, because we'll have a couple more polls to go on. But in a few words, what have you shared with your students or communities when it comes to climate change and global warming? So here are a number of the words that pop up and come up in your responses. And so solutions is the big word that jumps out. And one thing I'll say is that it's great that you're sharing solutions with your communities. That is definitely something that Project Drawdown and I would advocate for more. But beyond that, what else am I seeing here? So the science of climate change, hope, recommendations, conversations, ideas, workshops, the book, which might refer to the Drawdown book or other books that come to this work, climate system science. So there's a lot that you're sharing with your students, and it's all across the board, which is really great to see that there's no one size fits all approach. And I will come back to this because this question of what you're sharing with students is the point of today's webinar. So as I mentioned, Matt Scott, and I'll be talking about students discovering climate solutions, and really how Project Drawdown is a resource for a wide range of communities, but for educators in particular to take our resources and work them into your engagement with students, because again, we recognize there's no one size fits all approach. But as we start out, you can answer this question in the chat if you want, but I might spoil the point of this question in a couple of seconds. Typically, when I give talks and workshops, I'll ask the question, what comes to mind when you think of global warming and climate change? And I've asked that question to groups of educators, to groups of students, to community groups all over. And what's so interesting is that asking the question of what comes to mind when you think of global warming and climate change is typically pans out actually pretty similarly to the responses and the data that you see here from a 2018 climate action research report that asked this question to 14,000 people, and 44% responded with outcomes, 18% responded with causes of climate change and global warming, but only 3% responded with solutions. So it warms my heart to see your responses at the beginning, that you're sharing climate solutions, because we need climate solutions to be shared more with our students and with communities. As you might know more than most folks, because you engage with young people, so much of the messaging that's out there is about the problem. It's about the climate crisis. It's about the realities of the challenge that we're facing, as opposed to the opportunities that we have to do something. And at Project Drawdown, what we really focus on, other than just generally doing research on climate solutions, is in communicating climate solutions to people so that they could see that that learning about the climate crisis, while incredibly important, is only half of the story, if that. It's leaving out the reality of the opportunity that comes with climate solutions. And I'll talk a little bit about that, as well as some ways that your students could start to engage with climate solutions. But some of you might be familiar with the Drawdown book, which was released in 2017, and it's a New York Times bestseller with nearly 150,000 copies sold. And cities, governments, philanthropies, academic institutions, companies, a wide range of audiences have leveraged the Drawdown book and Project Drawdown more broadly to fuel their climate action, which has been really powerful. And it's so great to see that continue to this day. We actually released in 2020 an update on the solutions called the Drawdown Review. So you could find that for free on the Drawdown website. And actually, we're on the verge of releasing even more, another update to the solutions, which is coming. So I would say to keep an eye out for that. But some of you might be wondering what this funny word drawdown means. And drawdown refers to this future point in time, this moment of drawdown that we could reach when those greenhouse gas levels or heat trapping gas levels in the atmosphere stop climbing and start to steadily decline. And that's really the purpose of climate action and the work that we're doing. But the big question that we often get is, how do we achieve drawdown? It's probably a question that a lot of you get when you encounter your students and you share climate change with your students. Like, what could I do? How could we take action? Can we take action? And the beautiful thing is that thankfully, we have drawdown solutions in hand today. These are technologies and practices out in the world that are currently available. They're financially viable. They're backed by science and data, and they're proven to reduce greenhouse gas levels. And so just to be really clear with folks who aren't familiar with Project Drawdown, what we have done over the years is research climate solutions and identify which ones are the top ones. But a beautiful thing about that is that communities are able to look at that research and then bring those solutions to life based on the science and data and modeling that's available through Project Drawdown, through the Drawdown book, through the Drawdown Review, and also through the Drawdown website with the most up-to-date information. And when we think of climate solutions, really they exist to solve a really important problem, which again is the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And one thing that I would just share as a visual to help you wrap your head around all of this is that we have the current sources of emissions in our atmosphere. About 25% are from electricity production, 24% from food, agriculture, and land use, and so on and so forth. And that makes up 100% of emissions in the atmosphere. Thankfully, our planet has a beautiful way of having natural sinks that pull out many of those emissions from the atmosphere. So about 24% of those emissions are removed through land sinks. About 17% are removed through coastal and ocean sinks. But of course, that leaves almost 60%, about 59% still remaining in the atmosphere. And that's where Drawdown Climate Solutions really come in. This is the Drawdown Framework for Climate Solutions. And you'll see that it breaks down into three really important areas. So one of them is to reduce the sources of greenhouse gases. And that comes in the form of shifting production, of enhancing efficiency, of addressing waste in diets, in the form of using waste, shifting to alternatives, so on and so forth. And so I'm not going to dive into the Drawdown Climate Solutions because there are nearly 100 of them, but I will talk about how you and your communities can explore them more closely. There are also these solutions that support sinks, so land sinks, coastal and ocean sinks, and engineered sinks. These use degraded land, they shift agriculture practices. And finally, there are the solutions that improve society, so that indirectly support, help the world reach drawdown and support the work of drawdown solutions by supporting health and education and almost really empowering people with other resources and other capacities that help them best advocate for and implement drawdown solutions in their communities. So if you're looking at this framework of climate solutions and you're wondering, Matt, is that it? Is this what it takes to reach drawdown? Well, yes is the simple answer, but you'll also recognize, and I'm sure many of your students would recognize, that this doesn't leap off of the page necessarily. This doesn't necessarily show us the benefits that come with different climate solutions and how those come to life. And so when I talk about climate solutions, one thing I like to point out is this wheel. And I know, of course, you're not able to read all of the specific pieces of this wheel, but overall, this visualizes all of the drawdown climate solutions in the world today. You could see that center gray wheel with the sources, the sinks, and society. And then out from there are these clusters of solutions and all of our specific solutions listed out. And, one thing I want to stress in looking at this is that it can feel overwhelming. If you feel overwhelmed looking at this wheel of solutions and trying to read all of the pieces and seeing LED lighting and also distributed solar photovoltaics and reducing food waste and perennial staple crops, like, the reality is that you are not alone, and this can be overwhelming, which is one reason why in the work that I do, which I'll get into more in a second, I really focus on letting people know that what's important with climate solutions is not doing it all. It's figuring out what matters to you, and it's finding your role when it comes to solutions. And that's really the message that I work to share with students in the talks and workshops I do, or with educators who connect with those students. So when we talk about climate solutions, I actually like to reference this person who I'm sure many of you recognize. This is Mr. Rogers, who's one of the greatest educators of all time. And I love the idea of Mr. Rogers and his neighborhood, in the sense that what he really illustrated through decades and decades as one of the most prolific educators of our time is that really no person is an island. We all kind of exist in this neighborhood, and we can't do it all. Each of us plays a role. And my work at Project Drawdown, focused on storytelling, is on helping people kind of see that they don't need to do it all, and they don't even need to completely change what they're interested in or change their approach to what they want to do with their career. There are so many ways that they could plug in and make an impact when it comes to climate solutions, in a way that's really meaningful and interesting to them. And so that's where my work with Drawdown Stories comes in. But before diving in deeper into that work and into some of the ways that folks can engage, I have another poll for all of you, and another question. And that question is, who or what got you involved in educating others about climate change and global warming? You'll see here by now, of course, you're familiar with Slido. You're familiar with the code for Slido to answer this question, 185896, or you could scan the QR code. But I'd love to know who or what got you involved in educating others about climate change and global warming. As you respond to that, and I'm excited to see your responses, I'll just share that I love to ask this question because really what you're doing in connecting with your students is asking them to get involved, to engage, to care. And I know my own story when it comes to what got me involved, what got me engaged with climate change and global warming. You know your story. But your students might not have yet to, or might have yet to discover their own stories when it comes to what engaged them with this work. And so I am very curious what engaged you all. And I will give folks about 30 more seconds to respond here. again, you could easily scan the QR code, and I see a couple more responses coming in. All right, and feel free to add your responses even after I do pull up the responses in a second. So who or what got you involved in educating others about climate change and global warming? Someone responded their daughter. That's a big one I hear from a lot of folks, that their kids and really thinking of the next generation gets them involved. On that note, Youth Climate Summit is another a piece that comes to mind. Some folks have mentioned school, work, clubs, and then also the urgency. The wildlife is another thing that comes to mind. So kind of thinking of what we might be missing out on if we're not taking climate action. Seeing places I love changing, disappearing, and someone added, education is the only way to change the future. And so here are just some of the ways that folks have been encouraged to engage with climate change and global warming. But one thing I like to point out is even just the differences between these responses and what you shared at the very beginning in terms of how you engage with your communities and your students when it comes to climate change and global warming. Oftentimes, what I found in connecting with groups is that, or with educators, with community organizers, with others who want to connect with their communities, is that so often the approach is to share solutions or to share research and share information, make sure that the urgency and the crisis is so clear. But the disconnect that I've kind of picked up on and seen in my work with storytelling is that oftentimes what actually engages us is people. It is the world that we love around us. It is these things that we might not always think of in relation to climate change. So I'm sure for the person who responded, my daughter, you might not always, I'm sure you don't always think of your daughter in relation to climate change every time you see your daughter. Your daughter means so much more to you, and youth means so much more to us. But then when we think about what's engaged us, I think it's notable that there's a big difference between what we share and what's actually motivated us to be involved. And what I would encourage folks to consider is, like, what are the stories that we're telling? What are the stories and perspectives that we're sharing with students that we could maybe adapt to better engage them, to get them to care like we care or more, because it's their future, especially if they're really just getting started learning about climate change and global warming. So the thing that I want to get across, and something I like to get across in all of the work I do, is that the stories that we share really do matter when it comes to climate change and global warming and climate solutions. And I actually love to share this graphic, which is actually from and based on research from psychologist and economist Per Espen-Stoknes, who talks about the 5 Ds, or the 5 inner defenses of that prevent people from engaging with climate change. So essentially the 5 inner defenses that lead to ineffective climate communications. And he also talks about the 5 S's of more brain-friendly climate communications, which I will talk about in a minute. But the five Ds are distance. So when people are confronted with climate news or climate information or climate education, oftentimes it doesn't land for folks because often the way that climate change is positioned is that it's a far off thing that we don't have to worry about today, that's not critical for us to stress over, to work on today. There's also a sense of doom, and I talked about that. Many students wonder, first and foremost, I was talking with an education group the other day about this, that they've heard students ask the question, why didn't anyone tell me about this sooner? Why didn't anyone talk about climate change and global warming sooner? And then secondly, what can I actually do? And can I do anything? And unfortunately, oftentimes a sense of doom is fueled by just not having information about what they could do and about climate solutions. And so it's great to hear that you're sharing solutions, but a lot of people, unfortunately, don't have that exposure. There's dissonance, this idea that us wanting to preserve the way that we live and wanting to continue with what we think is right rather than adapting. This idea of denial, believing that it's not a problem or not a problem that we can address ourselves. Unfortunately, there's still a dialogue, not the most popular dialogue, but still a dialogue around the fact that some people would say that climate change is something that we can't do anything about. And we know that that is not the case. That's why we do the work that we do at Project Drawdown. And then finally, there's this piece of identity, which could be a barrier for effective climate communications. And I look at this in a couple of ways. Sometimes when we look at politics, for example, we found in terms of climate change that might lead folks to deny climate change or to not get on board with climate solutions. But another thing I would say when it comes to identity is that many groups and many identities, including my own, haven't always been represented in the climate space. And so when we think of climate change and when we think of climate communications, it's important to recognize that people's identities also form their perceptions of what they can do, if they can do something, and how they can show up. And so that is also something that often might get in the way of effective climate communication. But Per Espen-Stoknes also talks about the 5 S's of climate communication, and they're in not necessarily in order, but they're story, simple, social, signal, and supportive. And I will talk through why each of those is important. But these are really critical ways that I'd encourage you all to approach the work that you're doing with your students in your communities. Really be mindful of the fact that your story does matter, and the stories that you share, how you share them, who's featured in them, what's being said does matter. And here is an example of why from the work that I've done in Drawdown Stories and based on our on one drawdown solution, reducing food waste, which falls under the sector of food, agriculture, and land use under this cluster of addressing waste and diets. One way that we talk about reducing food waste is in terms of gigatons of carbon, and this is actually one of the Drawdown solution pages, which you could find at drawdown.org/solutions. And again, I'll make sure that you all have the links. But another way that we're shifting to talk about climate solutions is through stories. And the first S that I want to talk about is storytelling. It's shifting from sharing only the problems to sharing the stories of problem solvers, people who are doing something about it and making a difference. And what that really means is getting away from just talking about the crisis, just talking about the problem, again, to fill in gaps for people so that they know what they can do. This is actually a picture of someone featured in an upcoming Drawdown series, Project Drawdown Stories series, and I will introduce them on this next slide. So I mentioned stories as being one critical way we communicate, but social networks are really critical. It's so important that students and learners have access to relatable, trustworthy voices and stories. And so this is Alexis Cromer, pronounced she, they, who leads food recovery operations at 412 Food Rescue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And beyond just their wealth of experience, I think one thing that's so powerful about Alexis's story is that many stories of people of color, of non-binary people, and of just underrepresented groups in the climate space haven't been told. Alexis also lives with ADHD, and many climate stories don't necessarily feature that perspective and show people with all of these identities and perspectives featured. And so by showing stories and showing voices that are not currently represented, we help more people see themselves in the climate space. In addition, it's so important to show supportive framing. So this is a picture of one of the food rescue missions that Alexis and her team actually underwent. And when it comes to supportive framings, what that's all about is that it's about talking about the benefits of climate action beyond carbon. I was talking with a climate communicator recently who loves to point out that, it's hard for us, if not impossible for us, to picture what like a gigaton of greenhouse gases looks like. And I still struggle with that. But to show the actual benefits of some of the actions, for instance, when it comes to reducing food waste, a huge part of that is giving food to people, to places, to organizations that need them. And so talking about how this is helping people eat a meal and not go hungry is one way that I found that we get through to students. I know for many groups, like it is difficult for them to connect, as I mentioned, with broad and abstract numbers and science, which might not seem as relevant unless you provide some of these supportive framings. Another thing that's so important is to amplify the simple actions. So making climate friendly choices common sense is really important. And also when it comes to the stories we share, it's really important just to point out to people like, yeah, there was this organization that had a bunch of bagels left over at the end of the day, and they would have ended up throwing them in the trash. But instead, they're able to repurpose those and give those to people in need in their community. That for many organizations in the food waste space is common sense. And showing these different actions and showing why organizations and people might take action, not just for our climate, but because it makes sense for their business or for their operations, is really critical and another key piece of the stories we tell. And then finally, the fifth S that I want to point to is signals. So visualizing progress and solutions. This is a picture of Alexis and their team and some of their volunteers with a bunch of meals that are going out to folks in the community. And actually, they have achieved, as of October, more than 20 million pounds rescued in the last 5 or 6 years or so. And it's so important to visualize that progress so that you could see that it's not just about day in and day out giving people food, but actually that over time we are making progress and we're making a big dent when it comes to food waste. And that, as an example, when it comes to climate solutions. And so those are some of the things to keep in mind when communicating with students, especially when communicating with folks from communities that haven't always been represented. The key point that I would make as kind of we dive into some of the examples of resources that you could use to engage with your students is that the stories that we share provide not only representation for people, so they help them see themselves, they help students see themselves and see that they belong, but the stories also provide them with permission. And I feel like it's so important to stress this because even in my own experiences, especially as a Black person in the climate space, a largely white environmental space, which has been well documented by a number of studies, including one in Green 2.0, that often it could feel isolating to be the only one of you in the room, or to look at the stories that you see and not see people like you represented. It could give you doubts that, maybe I don't belong. Maybe I shouldn't be taking action when it comes to this. Maybe this is for other people. And really providing inclusive stories is one way of helping people have permission so that they feel like they could take action. They feel like they belong. And that's really critical before actually diving in and sharing resources or projects that your students can engage in when it comes to climate action. And so one thing I want to do is just introduce you to a number of resources that we have from Project Drawdown. And this is actually a screenshot of a page that we have set up that is over on Linktree. So I'm going to actually drop the link in the chat now. But over on Linktree, you're more than welcome to use this as you go on. If you visit tr.ee/project drawdown, you could explore some more of what I will talk about in over the next several minutes, and then I will have some time to give one more Slido poll and then get to some of your questions. But the first thing that I would share, as we provide resources to support folks in finding their role when it comes to climate solutions, is that I really think it's critical to often start with stories to help people find their role. Some some people and some communities are really familiar with climate change and climate action and committed to it, but at the same time, it's so important to realize that not everyone has that same background. Not everyone is meant to feel the same belonging when it comes to climate change and global warming. Not everyone sees themselves. And so I think that it's really critical to share stories that help people see themselves and find their role. At Project Drawdown, we're actually on the verge of releasing our first set of highly produced stories, and we invite people to watch and engage with the stories of these real-world superheroes. So one of them is Alexis Cromer, who you saw, but if you see this screenshot, this is an image of drawdown.org/stories, and on this page, this is kind of like the home of the different storytelling work that we've done. So there's one series, Drawdown's Neighborhood, which I'll talk about in a second. There's another series, Project Drawdown Dialogues, which you could find some videos from on the Drawdown Stories site. But ultimately, this work is really just getting started in terms of sharing these representative stories. And again, I mentioned Drawdown's Neighborhood as one of the first one. So really, our work at Drawdown Stories is focused on providing representation for folks. It's on sharing stories that haven't always often been heard. So, it focuses on sharing stories of women, of people of color, but also just of a wider range of people who've been represented, and truly having diversity in those stories that people, again, could start to see themselves and find their place when it comes to climate change. Here are just some of the people that we've interviewed and have either featured so far in Project Drawdown Dialogues, or they're featured in the Drawdown's Neighborhood series, which will be released in mid-March. So with Drawdown's Neighborhood, this is a series of short documentaries. This actually begins with 11 documentaries from Pittsburgh, and each of them is on average about 10 minutes long, and they provide a way for students and community members to hear from people who are working on climate solutions, whether it's people like Richard here, who's a solar installer, or others in just everyday roles, about who they are, about why they do what they do, about why they care. And this is one way of, again, helping people see that they do belong, especially helping underrepresented groups see that they do belong in this space. And these stories from Drawdown's Neighborhood, just to give an idea of who's included in the pilot. They feature a number of immigrants. They feature predominantly people of color. They feature predominantly women. And again, a wide variety of perspectives of people who just happen to be working to forward drawdown and forward climate solutions in their work. So one thing I'd encourage as I finish talking about Drawdown Stories and sort of run through the other updates is for you to visit drawdown.org/stories and just fill out this form to receive updates on our work, because with Drawdown Stories, we will not only be announcing and sharing the stories, but we will also be providing a number of engagement resources, including some curriculum supplements, and also we are working on organizing an Earth Day event that would give students and communities the chance to actually interact with and hear from some of the people featured in this series. So visit Drawdown Stories to learn more. But I start with that because stories are a powerful way of helping people find their superpowers. And once you kind of get people hooked with the story that shows them that they belong, that's where you're kind of up and running, and you have the ability to go far and go fast when it comes to climate solutions. So one resource I want to mention is Climate Solutions 101, which is a great resource to get introduced to climate solutions. And I would recommend that for, especially for you all as educators who are tuned in, but I'd encourage you to take a look at that and figure out if it's a resource that's good for your students, or maybe there are excerpts that you could pull out for your students if it doesn't all seem like it's engaging for them based on their age level or their like comprehension of some of the concepts in here. But Climate Solutions 101 is the world's first major educational effort focused solely on solutions. And Climate Solutions 101 features 6 video units, and each of them walks through climate solutions in a kind of base level way. And one thing that's been really incredible about Climate Solutions 101 is that folks from more than 50 countries and from about 40 states have used Climate Solutions 101 in their classrooms and communities so far. And so there's a wide range of age levels, of grade levels, of folks who've engaged with this work. But I'd encourage you to use Climate Solutions 101, not only because the video units are digestible and come along with these expert conversations about some key topics when it comes to climate solutions, but also there are key graphics that you could use to talk about the framework of climate solutions, about what drawdown is, and some of the other key points of climate solutions, like what are the lifetime costs and new revenues of implementing Project Drawdown climate solutions. And again, with Climate Solutions 101, you'll notice the theme. We love to hear from educators especially, and have a forum to ask for feedback and engage folks. Beyond that, though, once your learners navigate Climate Solutions 101, we have a number of resources to explore deeper. And so there are the drawdown solutions, and we invite you to explore the mosaic of climate solutions. And so if you visit drawdown.org/solutions, that's a place to kind of guide your own journey when it comes to solutions. Maybe you're not interested in alternative refrigerants or in bioplastics or in biochar production. Maybe you are more interested in solutions that are related to transportation, for instance. Well, this is a good place to have a self-guided journey. And something that we found is that often students will watch a couple of the videos from Climate Solutions 101 or watch the whole series, and then turn to this framework of solutions to start to explore specific solutions that resonate with them or are interesting to them. And so part of how we present that is that we also provide this table of solutions, which has a tiered list of what are the most impactful solutions, what are the ones that have the potential to pull the most greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. And again, you'll also see these individual solution pages like this one for bicycle infrastructure, which provides more information in terms of gigatons of carbon sequestered, and a technical summary that dives more into the data and sources of this information. So beyond actually exploring the solutions, I think some of the resources that I'm most excited by are the ones that make out the rest of this list. One of them is Changex, which is really focused on helping communities learn how other communities are scaling action, but also it is an amazing resource to help kick off action projects in the community. And so you'll see here's the Changex website with tens of thousands of people using it. And there's actually a filter for environmental and sustainability, and actually a filter for Project Drawdown if you want to find community action projects that are drawdown solutions. And so the thing that I love about Changex is that it gives you these community projects and it tells you where people are implementing them in different communities. So you could see here that there's a map where if you kind of click in on it, you could figure out where specific action projects are being implemented. And it really helps you see what's happening locally in your community. So either a great resource to explore and see who's working on a solution like community refrigerators, or to actually start your own project. The other thing about Changex is that it provides step-by-step guides. And so this is great for you to do as a classroom or as a student organization or club. But the other thing I love to note about Changex is that they also, for many projects, actually provide resources for the project to get started. And you could learn more about that at changex.org. Beyond that, speaking of local solutions, I love to point out the Solutions Journalism Network as a resource to discover stories near you. We talked about how climate solutions are often the solutions or the stories that we hear when it comes to climate change and global warming are often not focused on solutions. And so Solutions Journalism Network focuses on those stories and taking people from a world where you're surrounded by disempowerment, where you're surrounded by doom and gloom, into this world of possibility where you see what you could create and you see what your role is. And that's one reason that we partner with the Solutions Journalism Network, to really encourage people to explore and search for solutions that are near them, to find like how others are addressing some of the world's challenges. And so, again, more than 10,000 solution stories are listed out on Solutions Journalism Network and their story tracker. And there's actually a filter for climate solutions if you want to dive in and access more of those. And again, that is included on the beautiful Linktree link. Beyond the local community and things you could do with Changex and stories you could find with the Solution Story Tracker, I also love to recommend Drawdown Eco Challenge as a way to take action anywhere, individually or with a team, and it really makes climate action simple. And so if you visit drawdown.ecochallenge.org, you could join almost 10,000 other people who've participated in Eco Challenge and almost compete or work toward solutions in very tangible, specific ways. And so here's the example of food, agriculture, and land use, one of the categories of some of the actions within Drawdown Eco Challenge. And you'll also see that there are these very specific daily actions. So for instance, the first one, which says reduce animal products, plant-rich diets, which is one of the Drawdown climate solutions, it mentions, I will enjoy blank meatless or vegan meals each day of the challenge. So this is really a good place for you to commit, but also in line with those commitments and those actions that you fulfill, to earn points and to kind of track that with the team. Again, this is really great for educators and classrooms to use and has been active for a few years. And it's one resource, one go-to resource that I recommend, because not only does it track actions, but it also provides very specific action resources for folks. So I mentioned teams are part of this, and this is just a little bit more visualizing how the teams and points work. But in short, Eco Challenge does an amazing job gamifying climate solutions work and making it something that is a little bit more friendly for younger learners in particular. But also it's something that, like, even as a team at Project Drawdown, that we've participated in. So definitely accessible to people of all ages, which is another thing I like about some of these resources. And then finally, the last thing I'd recommend, which is also just a resource for all of you, is this employee guide, Climate Solutions at Work. We put that out as Project Drawdown. And again, it's included in the Linktree. And it really provides tangible ways that mostly employees could take action when it comes to ensuring that their organization is aligned with Drawdown and climate solutions. And so this might be something that you want to explore more. This also might be something that's helpful for your students. The big thing that I would stress, though, with this is that, and with all of these resources, is that there's so much that Project Drawdown provides now. We're constantly working on more resources, but hopefully you're able to take a look at these and figure out, like, what works best for your community, what works best for your learners, what works best for you. Because again, I can't stress this enough, there is no one size fits all approach, because different people start at different levels and need different resources and have different goals. So one question I have, a big question, is what will be your next step when it comes to engaging with your students and your communities? And that brings me to the final Slido poll of today. What will you share with your students or communities going forward when it comes to climate change and global warming? It could be a specific resource. It could be an idea that came up from today's conversation. But I would invite you to either scan the QR code or to visit slido.com and again, enter that code 185896. And I will give folks a second to respond to that, and we should still have a little bit of time for some questions. Great, I'm seeing responses come in here, but again, in just a few words, what will you share with your students or communities going forward? as I mentioned, I posted the link tree link in the chat. So I would encourage folks, especially after this, to like explore and click through the resources and dive in, figure out based on what I shared, what might be most relevant to your students and your communities, but also I would definitely encourage folks to connect with other educators about what they're doing. I know that that's what the Teach Climate Network is all about. It's about that connection. And so I hope you're able to talk with others about what resonates most or what stands out most. But so as we kind of wrap up and viewing the responses to this question, um, yes, inviting students to become solutions journalists is one thing. So really, yeah, engaging them in looking for stories of solutions and finding stories that resonate with them. One thing that I would stress, again, that I'm sure you all think about all the time, but that I've seen is that it's so powerful when students are able to guide their learning journey when it comes to climate solutions, whether that's finding stories that they like or that resonate with them, or finding a solution that stands out to them. For instance, maybe they love bikes and bike infrastructure is the one. There's a wide diversity of solutions, as someone mentions here, and solution makers. And that's definitely something that we want to get across because, again, climate change is a big challenge and it's really easy to feel hopeless in the face of it, even if you know all this information. And so to help people to see their role and to form a deep commitment with climate change is critical. The simple actions, local stories, successes, supportive framings, eco challenge, so on and so forth. I would again encourage you to consider more ways that you could kind of tap into some of these resources. The other thing I would just stress as I get toward the end is drawdown.org/stories. It is a good place to not only fill out the form to stay up to date on what storytelling work is happening at Project Drawdown and on when stories will be released, that would be helpful to get students engaged, but also it is a good way to if you scroll down to the bottom of the page, request a speaking engagement for your community, or just find other ways to try to connect the dots between your students and learners and climate solutions. But that is what I have to share for today, and I will actually hand it back to Seth and stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Matt. We definitely have some time for questions. I'll see if folks want to put anything in the chat, or you can at this point unmute yourself. I think you answered a couple as you were going along. There is one from earlier on that I've just put in the chat, Matt, about some Project Drawdown resources.
Yeah, so so the question is, just to read out loud, does Project Drawdown provide climate adaptation solutions or only climate mitigation solutions? And so I would encourage you to just explore the actual solutions that we provide. So we do provide primarily climate adaptation solutions, but something that's actually also really important in the work that we're doing is that we are always kind of like providing perspective on a wide variety of topics. So just the other day, we released a piece that was focused on the health and education solutions, which we first talked about in the Drawdown book, but we provided new perspective on that. And so we're always in our Drawdown website on the insights page, providing more information for folks on like, okay, but what's kind of our stance or what we encourage for folks when it comes to climate mitigation, what we encourage for folks when it comes to specific solutions in different contexts. And so, our solutions primarily are focused on adaptation. I'm also seeing some other questions, Seth, in the chat that kind of came from a little bit earlier, but one of them is, actually just the two questions that I'm spotting. Do you envision including international stories as part of your work, and how do you find your story subjects? So the first question from Eric, do you envision including international stories as part of your work? So actually, it's interesting. Project Drawdown is a global organization, but where I'm focusing my Project Drawdown storytelling work is actually more city by city in terms of the stories that we're telling, and looking to kind of pull out some of the themes from those from those city-based stories. In addition, we'll also have, and you'll hear about this more if you respond to the drawdown list, but we'll have webinars that are focused on giving people space to have conversation on or to have conversation about climate solutions and learn about them. And so those are not geographically bound in any way. Our audience is definitely international and global, but like really the stories that I focus on will start international, at least for this year and probably next year. But we are definitely still defining that and open to kind of reshape and shaping what that looks like as we go along. The other question from Dana was, how do you find your story subjects? And I think that this is an interesting one, because especially as we think about students discovering climate solutions, finding stories that inspire them, some of those will come from Project Drawdown and the work that I do, but also a lot of those could come from just searching and looking at local media and finding those stories. The way that I actually identified the stories that we've told is by connecting with the communities. And so, for instance, in the case of Pittsburgh, I had many conversations with different folks, some from like community groups, from actual climate solutions organizations, but also from city government, from organizations that are working to promote climate solutions in those cities. And so it was definitely a process to find people working on specific climate solutions. But one way I did that, other than just connecting with people in communities and asking, like for instance, asking chief resilience officers of cities who's working on some of their resilience or climate work, is to actually search for specific solutions. So who's working on reducing food waste in X city, for instance, is something that came up. And I see one more question, and one more question here from Tor, which is a longer question, but I'll read this out loud. So to engage our students, I'm exploring teaching them to become journalists, first picking a drawdown solution, then research where it is being implemented and writing an article, then sharing the article with the local community. I love this already. So do you have tips for how to interview folks or how to write/start solutions journalistic articles? What I would say with that is that, students are probably incredibly strong at this in the first place, because they've been the ones who've asked me like some of the best questions, in addition to educators, about this work. And so I will definitely say that, I would encourage you to check out, there's one resource called Planet Forward, and I believe it's planetforward.org. And I've been familiar with them for years, and they actually provide like storytelling toolkit. They support college, university students in developing their journalistic skills. And so I can make sure to post that in the chat in a second, just if folks are curious to explore the storytelling toolkit that they have. But that is definitely one resource that might be helpful for what you're doing, Tor. And I will post that in the chat. But that's the questions, and I'll hand it back to you, Seth.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again so much, Matt, for sharing all those amazing resources from all the great work that Project Drawdown is doing. We are coming up on our hour, so I want to again thank everybody for joining us this evening. As I've mentioned, I will be sending out resources, presentation, recording early next week, along with information about future workshops in the Teach Climate Network. But again, thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful night. We hope you join us in the future.